recording. And okay, I think I'm recording. Okay, hello. How are you doing? Can I get your name? Who are you? What are you?
I'm good. My name's Catherine. I am a junior at Chapman University, first generation Vietnamese American, studying graphic design and philosophy.
Very nice. And do you know why I'm asking you to come here today?
For a lesson on Asian American history, like early Asian American history.
Yeah. So more context. So I am named Kwak, in case the person who is watching this doesn't know who I am. Kat and I know each other because we went to high school together. And so we both kind of have, at least at a high school level, the same understanding of American history. I know that Kat, you are also quite invested in Asian American history, often just because of like interest or because we are both Asian Americans.
Yeah, identity.
Yeah. So what I am telling Kat and her reactions should be a good reflection of what I would have known before taking this class. And yeah, also like, the input of another Asian American and just the whole viewpoint of another person who is learning these things for the first time. Okay, are you ready, Kat?
Ready.
Okay, so early Asian American history. Oh my God. Oh, I guess you gotta press on it. Do you know the term perpetual foreigner?
Slightly. And
Okay.
I can figure out what it means, but
Do you want to take like a gander in what you think it means?
yeah, so I think with America and just like these first world countries, how they are and the systems that are in place, immigrants are perpetual foreigners because we are constantly deemed as guests in this country that we are trying to call home. But because of that, we are constantly guests. I can try to be more articulate, but
No, I think that's quite well spoken. So yeah, I think like I don't know, this phrase is definitely not something that has been explicitly stated in my class yet, but I think it's a good kind of indicator on the topics and kind of like as a theme that we may want to go back to, dismantle, come up, bring up, cite in future discussions as we're going along. Going on to, oh, also, do you know the person in the image? Just some like fun facts.
I don't.
Okay. Do you think this person, like, who do you think this person is? You don't need it to be like specific. It's like this person is like, why can't, George Takashi, I can't remember actors.
Takashi, I
Yeah.
actually follow him on Twitter, so I know it's not him.
Yeah. But I mean, like, you can be like, oh, it is a actor who probably is from this ode and he's like this race or whatever.
I actually can't say, but it doesn't look like. Actually, no. I don't know how he's being portrayed in this movie, but it's very expressive. So
Okay. Question, and I think it might lead you to the right trail. Do you think this person is Asian?
oh my gosh. I want to say no.
And why do you think no?
Personally, this is funny. I was just watching Kung Fu on CW, which has a history of it's like this TV show that had a movie series back then where I know like writers would write these Asian characters that were played by white people. And I think the glasses just throw me off a little bit. And also the the face and the lighting makes me think that he could be like a lighter skinned Asian person, but something about the glasses and just the small features about him.
Mhm.
So context and guessing, I guess.
Yeah. So interesting. Just side note. I've done this with like 2 other people so far, and if we count you, actually I've done this 3 other people so far, and if you count you, that's 4. So I've had 3 people so far say this person is not Asian, or like the actor is not Asian, or the person themselves isn't Asian. And then I have about 1 person said that he is Asian. And yeah, so the actor is not Asian. The actor, and I still haven't fixed my notes on this, but his name is Mickey Romney, and he was like a popular actor back in the day. This is a character that he played. It's supposed to be an Asian character in the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. Yeah, being at Chapman and the TV route and everything beforehand, I'm pretty sure you've heard of the name of the movie before.
Yeah.
Yeah. So also another thing, because like it's a summer course, I'm learning things at a very fast pace. So what I said in previous interviews or previous mini lectures with people that I've done this with before, you are getting more information than they had just because I'm learning more things as we're going on. So with everything you see with these types of characters, and as you're mentioning with Kung Fu, was it? Yeah, like yellow face, black face, all those types of stereotypes that we see nowadays, a lot of it is cemented within early American history through minstrel shows, you know, like when I think of minstrels, I think of the word bard, and I kind of say that's how you can think of it, you know, like, you know, those musical shows back in the day, but these minstrel shows, very blatantly utilizing racist stereotypes and racist caricatures of individuals, and a lot of what we see nowadays and what of like these appearances of what an Asian person is supposed to have comes from those shows, and a lot of it, like the tradition of having white people play Asian people, also comes from these minstrel shows. Do you want to kind of take a guess of like why these minstrel shows came about? And I know that like we're kind of having like there's no go and like any set thing that I've told you for you base this on, but I kind of want to get like kind of a eval of where you're at right now.
I think it just didn't seem like the Asian immigrants who were present in, I'm just going to say like the United States, because I'm assuming we're referencing Hollywood. There was just no spot for them. But because they were in America, so like people began acknowledging like, okay, these people are here, and their demeanor is approachable and digestible. But because it's white writers and white Hollywood and just white America, it's digestible in a way that they're making it digestible, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so these Asian characteristics and stereotypes, they become tropes, and like kind of like how they use like different types of humor for whatever else they did, like slapstick or whatever. Like it became like that, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. Just a clarification, because I'm pretty sure I'll go back to this later on, but in case I don't and I don't remember, minstrel shows were more like throughout all of America, not just Hollywood. I don't think Hollywood, this was like, minstrel shows were quite early on. Like I want to say early 19th or early 20th century or late. No, it was like 1850s. So
Okay.
very early on.
Okay. And I think that makes even more sense, because Hollywood is so selective with what they make, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But here it's like, okay, here are these people who are not us. It's very much like us versus them, but we're acknowledging them and we're going to include them, but just how we see them and how they fit into our narrative.
Yeah. And talking about that whole how people fit within other people's narratives, kind of want to ask you this question right now. What is race, or your understanding of race?
Oh my goodness. I studied this. I feel so horrible. I studied this and my mind's blanking. But race, I'm going to mess this up. You did not tell me to study for this. Okay.
I
From
want your raw knowledge.
now I'm thinking of like the people who don't look or don't even have like the biological background but claim that they're a different race. For my understanding, race is definitely a background thing. It's a biological thing, I think. Like biological heritage, like where you're originating from. And then it can go into like ethnicity and nationality. Okay, that's where there's also like nuances, right? Because someone can be of a certain race and a certain ethnicity, but identify with a different nationality. But I think race is biological. But I also know that race is something that's a construct, like it's based on biology and heritage, but it's definitely something that's like it's a structure that people have imposed to distinguish themselves from others in a very like I am better than you way.
Mhm.
White people, I'm just gonna say it, like from my understanding, that's how it is. And from vague memories of research, that's what I discovered as well. Yeah.
Okay, so I can kind of go into it right now. Just I think because saying it now helps frame later things going on better. Also because I kind of forgot to go back to these slides earlier with some other people. So are you aware of who these two individuals are? I doubt it. I don't think you would ever see pictures, even if you know the ideas they um, spread.
They look really familiar, so I might have seen like photos of them before, but no name.
So these two individuals, this is Omi, this is Wanat. I've only ever heard of them referred to as Omi and Wanat. I don't remember what their first names are. I'm sorry. They're kind of pioneers in these like social science field, especially around race, and they kind of popularized the term of racial formation theory. Are you familiar with that phrase or that terminology?
Phrase I've heard, but I'm not knowledgeable enough to explain it.
Mhm. Also, so I have a lot of background with the whole racial formation thing because I am a Marshall College student, and we have a whole thing about our writing sequence on racial formation and society and dimensions of justice and whatnot. But essentially, I can give you kind of like a breakdown of what race is or racial formation theory it is. It is that race is not inherently biological.
Mhm.
It is something that is a social construct with intangible and tangible aspects of reality that has been lived, deconstructed, experienced, this and this, through a mixture of social, historical, economical, political, cultural, and these other aspects. It's an intermingled, crafted identity. It is something that's both kind of adopted, created, and placed upon people.
Mhm.
And much of like the American understanding, American formation of race within American history has to do a lot with, as you said, like white people, white supremacy, white hegemony, and kind of like putting people in sidelined and subjugated groups of identity, which were justified on the premise of biology
Mhm.
or what we now understand as race.
Yeah, yeah.
And getting into the whole biology thing, fun fact, there's been like kind of genetic studies with people just doing like testing their genes and comparing it to other people. And you would see often that someone who would be black had a lot in common with someone who was white rather than another black person. And you kind of see that trend where it's like
Mhm.
DNA evidence doesn't really show any difference within races for the most part. It's more likely that like if your like ancestors had both lived in this area, you're going to share more commonalities with them rather than like how you look or anything like that.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense.
So just keep that in mind. So with both the perpetual foreigner, what is race? I think that gets really important to what we're going to go on to next. And let's start here. Who do you think, or when do you think Asian people, as we would understand them, first settled into America.
Am I allowed to reference what you mentioned in the car? When
Yes. Uh-huh.
I mean, I'll just repeat what we said in the car. I thought it was the Japanese Americans because of the wars that took place, and I know about like the, oh my gosh, why can I not formulate words? The internment camps where they were incarcerated, and that's as far as my knowledge was, but Nan actually mentioned that it was Indians. No,
Not
I'm
quite.
wrong. So it's not that's on me. That's not on Nan.
Yeah. So you're close. So it's the first people to like what we consider Asian people to come into America came on board along with Spaniard ships when the Spaniards were kind of colonizing and scouting out the land within America around the 16th century, so like, or 15th century. I get the centuries mixed up because, like it's 15th century, but it'll be 1600s or like, yeah. But within that time period, they referred to themselves as Indios Lucinos, but we would kind of recognize them more today, or like we'd understand them as we understand people today as Filipino.
Manila.
Yeah. And so Manila men, the word, do you know where the word Manila comes from?
I just associate it with the Philippines, but I don't.
Yeah. So it's a my girlfriend told me it, and then I was like, oh yeah, that's right. And she's like, why do you look like this is the first time you heard it? I'm like, don't make fun of me. It is a like central trade city within the Philippines.
Okay.
Yeah, it also so happens to be the name of the Spanish galleon, which these Filipino people, these Manila men, had jumped off ship around sometime in the 1700s, ending up in an area, the Bayou, and like the word Bayou, can you guess where that is within America?
Louisiana.
Yes. And so this was 1700s. They jumped off ship in the Bayou, kind of, if you know your Louisiana history, first by the Spanish, then transferred to the French, and as we know in American history, bought by Thomas Jefferson.
Yes. Question mark.
My president history is kind of mixing up. The second president, I want to say Thomas Jefferson.
The second president?
Second president. No, not Thomas. Third president. Second president was John Adams, yeah. And then third president, Thomas Jefferson. Bought Louisiana. So these people, these Manila men, these people that we would consider as Asian, had settled the land way before the area was even considered America. So that kind of goes back to this kind of question we have right now, which is, so what really is this perpetual foreigner? Where did the term perpetual foreigner come from? Because these people have arguably been here as long as some of the colonists and some other Americans.
Yeah.
Would you want to have any, do you have any comments on that?
Can you repeat what year they came?
The Manila men or the Indios Lucinos?
Both.
Indios Lucinos came with the Spaniards around 1500s, 1600s, and then the Manila men were specifically sometime in the 1700s.
Okay. And I honestly don't know my American history very well, but
Louisiana Purchase was sometime in the 1800s.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so we've had European immigrants coming after Asian American or Asian immigrants, right?
Yeah.
Because it was the Italian and the Irish migrations.
Yeah. That's going to be a very big subject too, going into like some of the last slides.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so like kind of placing the framework with like this idea if you're a perpetual foreigner, but yet Asian people, as we'd understand them, were here so much earlier than other people. And now kind of the question is, these Manila men, as we kind of established, they were here before some Americans were. But when Louisiana kind of got acquired by the US, these Manila men, like they've already set up a whole community here. How do you think they kind of interacted with the Americans at the time?
Can you define what you mean by Americans?
Like, the people who are living in colonial America, then to early 13th state America, and then going into the 1800s America. So predominantly, white people.
I mean, just knowing how interactions went between those Americans and like natives, I can't imagine that things were peaceful or that there was a lot of respect or accommodation. Or maybe people would try, but I don't know. Not, I don't know about that one.
Yeah. And then a side question go along with that. How do you think these people kind of identify themselves and their descendants?
The Manila men or the Americans?
The Manila men. I guess like it would most predominantly, how do you think their descendants would identify themselves?
As American?
As American? And what type of American do you think they would identify themselves as? I think that was a hard question.
I mean, honestly, I always say I'm Asian American because I can't even bring myself to say just American because I don't feel it.
So are you ready for some culture shock or some historical shock?
Themselves as white?
Yeah. So this is a picture from, I kind of was bad at looking at the dates when I got the picture, but I want to say based off of the tint on the picture, being a photography person, I want to say this is around the 60s to 80s.
Sure, yeah.
And you can clearly see that there is large intermixing and mingling with Filipino or Manila men and white people, right? This person right here specifically, she is a 6th generation descendant of one of the original Manila men. And so these people consider themselves as white. And this kind of gets back into this whole idea of like race formation, where it's a mixture of so many complex parts. And another component we can add to that is that what your race is can also be tied to historical context and geographic context too. And yeah, and we're not even talking about geographic context as like nationality, like where these people and their ancestors may have come from. We're talking about like they were in the Louisiana, in the Bayou area, versus being in, I don't know, California at the time.
Yeah.
Also within my class, watching some interviews with people from like these communities where Manila men had previously been, they considered themselves as American, white, and then Filipino, and then Asian American. Yeah. And kind of like the question to bring up though is, why do you think this was possible? That you see this kind of like peaceful mingling and interracial marriage, even though racially seeing, like legally seeing, like legally on a legal sense, these people were considered as white, yet we would kind of consider this as an interracial marriage. Why do you think this was kind of possible?
I'm honestly unsure because this entire time I was thinking like, okay, well, like I said before, I thought that they would identify themselves as like Asian American, or I was thinking even like Manila American, even though I hadn't ever really heard that. I do think, however, that it is related to how just non-Manila Americans perceived the Asian person. And I also think there's something to say about how they came to America with the Spaniards. I don't know, like, see, here's my thing. I don't know if I can link it to like the model minority idea where like Asians, and we all know like model minority isn't valid and Asians aren't a monolith, but it's the idea that like Asians are approachable and amiable. where they would get along with people well and easily because they don't want conflict and issues and they would rather just assimilate. I'm beating around like 3 different bushes here. So tell me if I got one.
Uh, Definitely think the conditions and the times in which these people have come plays a very big factor. Asian American or Asian culture and kind of what we grew up around. I can't speak much about Filipino culture. Like Asian cultures vastly differ from one Asian country to another, but and I believe that like I know Filipino culture the least out of any other Asian culture, so I can't really speak out on that. And can't
Yeah,
remember the other one, but like yeah,
sometimes everything isn't valid because it tries to group everyone together.
yeah. And so just like kind of thinking of those things along. So like conditions and when people came, um, Asian culture, and kind of just like the last thing. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Uh-huh. What else is kind of like interesting to note here too? Also around this time period, bring up the idea of race. You had like for a long period of time, kind of just racial identities start being developed from, I want to say like the development of America around the 1800s onwards later on too. So what you'll see if you want to look at like census data, perhaps, races become crafted and they grow at an exponential level as more and more immigrants come. But for these individuals who arrived to America before that racial category was defined, they would often find themselves struggling to figure out what classification of what race to put themselves in. I think a prime example was that someone in my class mentioned that they had an Armenian professor at campus, and that Armenian professor was talking about how they have trouble like racially identifying themselves within America, especially on like official paperwork, because there isn't really a spot for them to neatly put themselves within unless they want to like type in other.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a lot of people around this time, like you see white men, white women being two separate races, as well as like unfree person and then other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to note, I had a friend tell me that sometimes, like when she's like your Armenian professor, like she wouldn't be able to like check anything because some forms just omit like Middle Eastern entirely.
Yeah. And so kind of going back to like that racial formation idea, keeping that in mind, these people didn't really experience racialization as Asian, and kind of keeping that in mind, why did that happen? So going on to the next part, getting into why this racialization of Asian has occurred. Are you familiar with this term? I'm going to be using it in historical context, just to historicize the event and the term. Are you familiar with the first word?
I'm not.
Okay, so this word, Coolie, is a derogatory name for an Asian person, used back then and nowadays. The word itself, according to a Google search, has roots meaning slave or laborer, and it's quite fitting because it was used historically on South Asian and Chinese laborers within the US around the 19th century. And just kind of getting a gauge for why you think these people were in America. Why do you think these South Asian and Chinese people were coming into America around the 19th century?
The 19th century?
Mm-hmm.
Were they not brought over for this purpose?
Okay, brought over. Yeah. Do you have any guesses on why they were brought over, or do you want me to
Like
keep
for
going
this purpose?
for this purpose?
Yeah, like enslavement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of a big factor. So placing kind of context, late 19th century, or just 19th century. This is post Civil War, post antebellum, and post what I don't think most people recognize is a global phenomenon for abolishing slavery. So, like slavery in its traditional sense was abolished mostly globally. And so now you have this like void within the economy for cheap labor. And it just so happens that these Asian people needed to be taken out of their country for specific reasons. And they kind of filled the spot for cheap labor. They were mostly indentured laborers or very poorly paid laborers, but essentially like
Yeah.
they worked the same things that slaves were, and the way that they were brought into other countries or into like these kind of colonial imperialistic areas were very similar to the way that African slaves were. Do you have any guesses onto why like these people kind of felt like they needed to flee their country, or why these people may have been like possibly taken from their country?
You said the 18th century?
So it was 19th century, but it would be like the 1800s.
Imperialism.
Yeah, so that kind of like hit it on the nose. So a mixture of imperialism and a bit of political instability within their own country led to this mixture of really bad opportunities staying in the homeland. And yeah, imperialistic expansion, you know, you got your British East India companies and your Dutch East India companies setting up like very aggressive trade posts within these Asian countries, leading to a lot of conflict and turmoil, lots of wars, bloodshed, and kind of the destabilization of the area. And there's a lot of coercion, a lot of manipulation. Maybe even you can consider like the whole destabilization of the country itself to be a large imperialistic manipulation on the overall trends that you're seeing within these countries, forcing people to go about and participate within the coolie labor. So it's kind of like a bit tragic that you see that people were pushed out this way because of imperialism, and kind of sensing like labor playing into a big factor with the way we kind of see Asian Americans nowadays. So kind of going on to the next part, leading to the next part, are you aware of the term the Opium Wars?
Familiar with it. And I know what opium is, but
yeah. So Opium Wars, it was kind of the transition for China to be employed within the coolie labor system. And I know with other people, when I ask them, it's like, oh, like why did people feel like they needed to like go to other countries, or why were people being like, why was the Asian diaspora present within this time?
so sorry. I need to plug in my charger.
Oh yeah, gotcha.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So just like asking people beforehand, are they familiar? Like, why do you think the Asian diaspora occurred, especially like around this time period? People were like, oh, better opportunities. I'm like, okay, why do you think they needed better opportunities? And they're like, oh, the country wasn't great. I'm like, why? And then someone said like, oh, the country is developing. And I'm like, okay, you have China.
Mm-hmm.
China's been like an empire for like such a long period. And so you see a lot of this happening because of the Opium Wars, and especially like you see the strength and like the consequences of imperialism on China, which happened because giving context for the Opium Wars during the Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1911, China was an immense trade power thanks to exports such as tea, porcelain, spices, other goods that everyone wanted. But you have these European empires, especially Britain, who wanted to kind of have most of that power, to be like the ones who were capitalizing and being able to tap into that market, tap into the power and resources that China had. So how were they going to do this? Because China itself had very strict trade regulations that was upheld through something known as the Guangzhou system. So how to do this? Planting drugs in the community. Yes. So context on opium itself. Opium was an illegal drug that was illegal to grow and sell within Britain, but they utilized like the territory that they had basically conquered from India to grow that, even though it was still illegal by British law. selling it within China, even though that was illegal, and also illegal to sell within China. But what ends up happening is that people get access to opium, people grow a dependence upon opium, and you get kind of like a social moral issue. Chinese government decides to crack down on it, get rid of all the opium. British government, furious that their goods are being confiscated, being thrown away, even though, remember, these are illegal goods. And that sparks what is now known as the Opium Wars, kind of the emphasis on plural because there were two of them. The first one ending with the British winning because they were a very big naval power. That led to a series of unequal treaties. The first one, the Treaty of Nanjing, that couldn't be fulfilled by China within the amount of conditions and time that British wanted, leading to the Second Opium War, which the British won again, leading to the Treaty of Tianjin, if I'm remembering correctly. Essentially, the results of these treaties were the giving up of land from China. Think of Hong Kong. China having to raise taxes by immense amounts because they were billed with the damages of war, opening up separate trade ports specifically for Britain to be their preferred trade partners, and having opium be legal, which created more social problems within China. So subsequently, as you can kind of expect, this led to the conditions which were not great within the country, and that led to a great mass of desire for people to move out of the country, sparking this Asian diaspora, or people would be coerced and manipulated into participating in the Coolie trade. Either one. That's kind of a lot. Do you have any comments, concerns, questions?
Did you have to read The Good Earth in high school?
The Good Earth?
Yeah.
No.
So, freshman English honors, we were assigned a summer reading called The Good Earth. And I wanted to see if you knew if it took place during the Opium Wars. I'm guessing it was either around this time or after. But yeah, opium that's how I know about opium. But yeah, like thinking about it, like if things were good, no one would want to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Or not willingly,
Yeah.
So it's either by force or by condition, which is also forced.
There is don't want to use specific names, but if we went to the same middle school together, I'm not 100% sure, and you took one of the history classes, US history, we had one teacher who was very big on this idea of push-pull factors, right? Like you don't get immigration, migration at all unless you have some push-pull factors. He never really talked about like where these push-pull factors can kind of come from. You kind of just like can see clearly like, oh, there's a push factor to go here, there's a pull factor to go here. But I guess like you can see the Opium Wars as how imperialization created a lot of factors.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so now we kind of get into China and America and Chinese American, or specifically the Chinese coolies at this time, because naturalization and citizenship for Chinese people was not easy. So how familiar are you with Chinese American history?
Not very familiar. And honestly, going through this presentation, it makes me feel like I'm not familiar with a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That is quite fair. I'm just kind of like a history nerd, so some of this I knew, but a lot of it was very shocking for me too, or just new for me to learn or relearn, because some of it was pushed down by, I don't know, math.
Hear things, or like you'll see things like, oh, some history nerds Twitter thread, but
Yeah. So going back to this, so Chinese American, Chinese in America, end of Civil War, as we're kind of going about post Civil War, post abolition, post bellum, you have former slave owners and what I think a lot of people kind of overlook, industrial developers who were in need and searching for cheap labor. Who better to fit this cheap labor than a bunch of mass migrants coming into the country who are capable of being easily exploited? Thinking of this time too, you don't just have Asian people coming into the country. You have, as you mentioned earlier, Irish, Italian, etc., etc. And we're going to get to that right now. And if I don't, please remind me.
Okay.
Yes. So before the Civil War, you still had Chinese people coming into the country, but you had a lot of arguments on whether or not to adopt coolie labor. And some of the arguments centered on just the fact that like so much of investments and so much of structural development and land and property and work was already tied within like African slave labor. And kind of thinking about this right now, like people don't want to give up their jobs. As bad as slavery is, it is kind of like one of the top job security things. You know, you are a slave basically your whole life. Your children are it, generations wise, right? You had very high job security, terrible job, not really a job, but yes. And so people didn't want to give up on that because it's basically like cheap labor. Well, now you have, and also you had very just prejudice and racism against Asian people, and they didn't want to hire Asian people as such. But now that slavery is illegal, people are like, you know what, just take them on, make them work, indentured servitude, pay them cheaply. And yes, yeah. Any questions on that so far? Yeah. So you kind of see like a huge parallel between the adoption of Chinese labor with the end of slavery, and kind of you can kind of see how like Chinese labor adopts many of the practices from African American slave labor, while also being the successor to it in a sense, how it can develop its own subsequent identity from that. And I'll get into that in a bit. So a large proponent of injustices and inequities seen upon Chinese immigrants came from class inequities and came from kind of class competition. As you're mentioning, you had Irish people, you had Italian people, you had this and this. So competing for a job and job security was no longer a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
You had people fighting against each other. And what I think most people also don't realize is that not every white person is a wealthy aristocrat at the time. And so you also had white laborers going into the mix. And what you see is that you have these aristocrats, these wealthy people, these industrialists who want to maintain their economic power, their status, while also trying to figure out a way to employ people. And so what you get is, how do we ensure that these people coming into the country stay in their respective economic statuses and their labor classes? And race was a big one. Granted, by adopting the usage of race, they would have to acknowledge white people to have forms of mobile or social mobility, but that was easier to accomplish rather than having these people that they had innate prejudices against moving upwards.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you'll see in a lot of political cartoons at the time are Chinese people fighting with Irish people who are also fighting against other people who are all ultimately kind of competing against each other for the whims of white Americans. And what you see too is that white Americans are visualized as normal people, whereas these Asian people, these Italian people, these Irish people, they're all characterized as kind of like bestial characters, right? So you kind of start seeing some racialization at the time. What you also start seeing is kind of, why is violence a key component to a lot of this? And kind of my personal hypothesis surrounding that is that patriarchy is also a huge component in civilization, in early civilization. You know, we're only recently we're kind of addressing the idea of like dismantling the patriarchy. But in patriarchal societies, how do you show one person being superior or inferior than another? Physical violence, hypermasculinity, physical violence.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And so, yes, now going back into specifically Chinese labor, you see a lot of Chinese people working mining, working railroads, this and this, but primarily it starts with mining.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a lot of people mining, especially in California. So you have a large Chinese population within America, within California. As mining work begins to die down, and kind of key point is that you hear the term that mining work dies down, and people kind of like flock to different industries for that. What you kind of don't really see is that the statement that mining work for Asians died down a lot sooner than it did for white people, because as industrial innovations began to become better and work became less and less dependent upon a large group of people, much of the labor started being given to white people rather than to Asian people. So Asian people were kind of forced off of the mining work a bit sooner than white people were. Mm-hmm. And the industries that these Chinese people started flocking to now came to railroads. And do you want to guess some of the other two?
Like working at the docks.
Yes.
I don't have a better guess. So farming.
So farming was like not as discussed about, but yes, farming is always big. The other one was laundry.
Oh, that, yeah.
Yeah, you got your Chinese laundromats.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with railroads. It's becoming more and more well known nowadays that the Transcontinental Railroad within America, built by immigrant hands, specifically Asian American hands. But if you ever look at images trying to find the people who built the railroads, it's very hard to find like commemorable pictures of the completion of the railroads with any Asian people inside of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of ties back really well with this idea of perpetual foreigner, because, like these Asian people, they're foreign. They're not ones to celebrate this innovation, this development of American greatness, even though they were the ones building it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you have any comments regarding that?
It's giving me a similar energy to companies in America that outsource to like workers in India or the Philippines. Yeah, but
Mhm.
never really given the credit for it. Really not acknowledging the backbone.
Yeah. And so then you have Chinese people on the railroads. Once railroad labor kind of dies down with the completion of the railroads, you get the movement of Chinese labor into the remaining two industries: laundry, fishing, and basically whatever else that you get, farming, etc.
Mm-hmm.
What people don't really understand about laundry is that, nowadays you kind of picture laundromats like you're using washing machines and having your clothes dried. Back then, not a lot of automation. You're doing a lot of things manually, and a lot of it has to do with steam. And I want to say, as like adults, we've experienced hot steam hitting our face at least like once in our life.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine having that happen constantly to you. So laundry labor, very harsh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But one of the reasons why Asian people were capable of finding work within laundries was that it wasn't a market that was seen as competitive for white men.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of tying back to this like idea of patriarchy and hypermasculinity, after the railroads died down, Asian people were feared under this yellow menace, yellow peril conundrum, so when Chinese people moved to America, not a lot of families coming and not a lot of women coming. You had a very large bachelorette community of Chinese men. And so the fear was that now that these people were not so focused on labor and work, with the drying up mining and railroad industries, white America was scared that Chinese people would start becoming sexual predators, oversexed or undersexed, hypersexualized men, Chinese men, would be predating on white women, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where you see a lot of kind of like a counter culture racist imagery being utilized to deconstruct that narrative and also kind of belittle Asian men, right? You had men, because they're working, or like Chinese men working in these laundromats, they are becoming more hyper feminine. They're kind of being looked down upon, etc., etc.
Mhm.
And that's also where you kind of see like this idea of like Asian bullying and Asians being put down through physical violence and whatnot. I think that can tie back into like more modern day visualizations where you see a lot of racist acts committed to Asians are along more of those physical violent acts.
Right.
Mhm. Do you have any comments regarding that?
I'm just still taking it all in how yellow peril connects to society's perception of Asian men now.
Mhm. I think Simu Liu, I always feel bad because I know for a fact that I'm not saying his name right, but Simu Liu, the actor within Kim's Convenience, and he's going to play the new Asian superhero in the new Marvel movie, Shang-Chi. He talks about it quite a bit sometimes regarding like this kind of idea that Asian men are not desirable. Kinjas, if you know World of Dance, that dancing competition show that aired a few years ago, they had one dance, the one where they throw the handkerchief and it, like they catch it. Beautiful scene. I think that's like my favorite dance I've ever watched. That dance was kind of in respect to how they wanted to show this counter idea that men are desirable, Asian men are desirable. But yeah, so a lot of these ideas get popularized around the country. Oh, another thing regarding Chinese labor is that along with competition with Irish people, Italian people, and white people, you have your unionizations when you'd have like people working in industries, right? And industrial labor. How aware are you about unions when it comes to industrialization?
Can you rephrase that question?
Yes. um, how familiar are you with union practices during like the industrial period?
Not very familiar. I can say stuff about like modern day, but
Yeah. So unions back then were racially segregated. But what you end up seeing is that there were practically very little or no Asian unions, and Asian people were not invited to be included within these racial unions. So what you end up happening is now these Asian people are kind of like in a separate category, not included within unions. So who's going to take advantage of them? The employers. And what ends up happening is that employers utilize Asian people to break up strikes and break up unions, right? You always hear the thing where like unions would go on strikes, but then they like businesses would end up hiring more people. A lot of the people they end up hiring were Asian people. So that also contributes towards a very negative stigma against Asian people at the time. And a really big thing is that like, you know, nowadays, like being anti-corp or being anti-big business is about being like anti-Amazon, anti-this and that. It kind of devolves into being anti-Jeff Bezos, right?
Yeah.
With Asian Americans being ones who are kind of exploited by employers and kind of taking on these roles of being associated with jobs and with work, being anti-capitalist and anti-big business at the time also was utilized and kind of marketed as being anti-Chinese, anti-Asian.
I mean, I think you could still say that now, especially in like regarding Amazon, you know, and China being this mass producer that it is. Although being anti-Chinese is a whole nother thing now.
Yeah. And so you have all these kind of just components leading towards what would now be known as like the racialization of Asian stereotypes and Asian things. Now, how do these stereotypes, these depictions, these negative aspects get popularized? Let's going back, we have these ideas of Perpetual Foreigner, and specifically you have these minstrel shows. You also have news depictions, news, the fear of the Yellow Menace, just general society being so fearful against Asians at the time for being foreigners, for bringing about this kind of cultural societal change, competition, etc., etc. So how do they go about this? Utilizing minstrel shows to kind of demean Asian people, to encapsulate the negative stereotypes that were being painted upon them, and to kind of just alleviate the stress and fear of other working class people who these minstrel shows were catering towards. And so you get a lot of shows going around that kind of belittle Asian people, kind of play them out as these like immoral men. And versely with the immoral depiction that you have of Asian men, Asian Chinese men, you have also immoral depictions of Chinese women. And keep in mind that Chinese women were not in America. There wasn't really any image to go about them other than just like, if Asian men are like this, then Asian women have to be like this. And the depiction of what Asian women are were prostitutes, whores, etc. And so you see a lot of shows like that. Think of Madame Butterfly, which I think is kind of weird because I know like the Madame Butterfly that you and I read was the kind of satirical parody of it. But I think that one also kind of shows like what America tried to do to Asia, where they are demeaning, subjugating Asian within popular culture so that males and just America could dominate Asia. Kind of a reflection on imperialism, and a reflection on how people felt about Chinese labor, Asian labor, etc., etc., kind of like tying all these components together. And I guess to end off then, how would you kind of describe all of this now that I kind of explained it out for you?
Horrible, not surprising, like surprising in the way where it's like, oh my gosh, that's like horrible. And I was gonna say something else, but like horrible, but not surprising in how everything played out. I feel like even with this presentation, you can clearly see like, okay, imperialism, the setting in America back then, like this every man for himself type of mentality, and that whole like viewing early Asian Americans as the other, and therefore like not an equal man or a man at all in some cases. It's just, it sounds like it's very much rooted in greed and fear and self-preservation. And like the self includes like your people, but that does not include those Asian Americans.
And kind of skipped over this part, but I think you're kind of getting to it. Like, how do you think these Manila men kind of fit into the picture then, or their descendants? It overcomplicates the story now, right?
Yeah.
And now adding more layers onto it, it's like, but where did these prejudices come from though? Because is it that economic status, economic insecurity perpetuated prejudice and racism, or was it the things that created prejudice and racism? Because you have like, let's go with ancient Greek society, because they're the only ones I can really remember on the top of my head. You had racism back then, or what you can consider as prejudice against other people, because anyone who didn't speak Greek was considered a barbarian. Yeah. And other societies and other cultures, like ancient civilizations, were very hesitant and fearful of foreigners. So kind of this idea, it's like, what is the root cause? What is kind of the symptoms rather than the disease? What is the things that perpetuate? What is the engine, or versus what is the motor?
Exactly. And I feel like the more that time and history progresses, the more not interchangeable, but you can mix those two up very easily. It's like the chicken and the egg, right? Like there has to be that first egg holding the chicken. Agree to disagree, but afterwards it's just like chicken egg,
Mhm.
right? And I think that's what you were kind of getting at with like the engine versus the motor, was it?
Yeah, I'm using like an analogy in my professor hat.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I I
Those are my
think
questions. I know. Sorry.
no, you're good. Like I feel like it's corrupted fear of the unknown. And it's corrupted with like knowledge or like knowledge of, biases and agendas that really just add to the treatment. And so it becomes just standard, like, okay, this is how I perceive you. It's like how, like, I remember having a conversation with one of my philosophy professors, and it was like, yeah, like I had a friend who didn't know better, and they saw a person of color on the street, and they were automatically scared. And they moved to the different side of the street. And it was like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. Like, you're a horrible person for doing that. But also, it's this thing that's just instilled in them and it's taught. And it's a culmination of, like that fear of the unknown being corrupted with all of these ideas that just persist. I feel like I'm not even answering this question anymore.
Yeah, I'm getting your takeaways. That's kind of the idea.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. But there's definitely some like bias from the start, or
Mhm.
else there would not be a need for that corruption.
Mhm. Yeah. And so, do you have any final questions that I may try to attempt to answer? Any comments, further latent comments?
I learned a lot that I didn't know. Like I had no idea that history of early Asian Americans was so honestly just different from my own perception.
Mhm.
And I think that's I am so sorry that I cannot formulate words. Um, I think that's a testament to how little we know about n- non-typical Asian American history, like even as Asian Americans ourselves, but also like I was saying before, like the monolith idea of being Asian Americans. That's so like not true. Like when I was thinking like Japanese Americans, like I wasn't even thinking Manila men at all. And I feel like that just comes to show like there's so much to it. And the treatment definitely doesn't help. It definitely groups us together as, the peril or the menace or the prostitutes or whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunate that it persists.
Yeah. So, do you feel more appreciative of your status now, of everything happening in the world now, or do you just kind of see it as kind of a continuation of everything that early Asian Americans had to face?
A little bit of both. Like, I'm not going to say that, you know, like what we are facing now is the same as like the, at least in America, like the internment camps and the enslavement and, you know, like that labor that's basically slavery. And, you know, like Yellow Peril, Yellow Menace, like even ideas from Yellow Peril and Yellow Menace, like they're still here today. Like you can see it on someone's TikTok For You page easily. Or however, like they swipe on Tinder, you know? But I think a lot of it, it's better, but better in a way where it's not like how it was before. But there's still issues, and I feel like the themes are still present and the essence is still there, just in a different, more modern day form that may be more accessible or palatable to the standards of social justice that we have.
Mhm.
And I think now, because we have more roots in America as a race, as just like a collective, some more than others, there's a lot of things to be said about how we can fix how we view ourselves and seeing how the treatment of early Asian Americans has affected how we view ourselves and our place in America. Yeah. But also, Nan, I am inspired. I was talking to my advisor actually about doing a research project about Asian American identity.
Mhm.
And I've been struggling to think about like what to circle on, but I think I'm getting closer. And I may message you about it later for like a presentation or something.
Yeah. And then I guess for final remarks, I just got two books right here, I guess. One of them, oh my God, you can't even see it. Well, let's see. Okay, well, this is Robert Takai's book called A Different Mirror, and it's just kind of like reframing American history as told by basically the untold stories, the races that built America. Ronald Takai himself is a Japanese American, so interesting read. And this one is The Sympathizer. I'm quite confident that you have heard of it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I feel like everyone in our area who is kind of a little bit into the whole Asian American history is aware of this book. It is a book about kind of just the Vietnamese War and kind of investigating the Vietnamese War through the lens of American imperialism versus what we are taught about what the Vietnamese War is. Because I was always taught that the Vietnamese War was America's biggest failure with no context on that statement whatsoever.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
Okay, can I also just say, like, I had to study Miss Saigon, I think is what the musical is called.
Yeah, I've heard of that before.
Um, so many issues,
Uh-huh.
so many issues. And it's like, it's the same thing, like it's Vietnam's war, but through the eyes of America.
Mm-hmm.
That like savior complex type of thing. Like, oh, like the portrayal of the Asian woman as like this butterfly, but also like kind of homewrecker-ish, but sweet, but sympathetic, but not like not heroic in their own sense at all. Like just how they view Asian countries as compared to the power that is America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
um, that's all I had. Very interesting topics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Even when I still talk about this, I'm still learning new things with each person I'm talking to.
Which is really cool.
Uh-huh.
Like, I wonder if you can make a doc. Like, I don't know. I'm interested, just in case like you haven't shared anything that someone else has mentioned that you think is like interesting and noteworthy.
Yeah. well, part of this project is to post about it. So then, if you want, I'm probably gonna have to post this on some YouTube channel.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool.
Mhm. So, yeah, I'm just gonna end the recording now. Oh, yeah. Can I end the recording? How do we do that?